Hello dear students, welcome to our series on geography. Today let us discuss about the topic heading that Adaptation to Hazardous Zones. You all know India is one of the more vulnerable and risk prone countries in the world. Over the centuries, its population has learned to cope up with a wide range of natural and human made hazards. Rapid population growth, high densities, poverty and high differentials in access to housing, public services and infrastructure have led to an increase in vulnerability over the last few decades, especially in India's urban centers. Climate change is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of current hazards and the probability of extreme events, and also to urge the emergence of new hazards and new vulnerabilities with differential spatial and socio-economic impacts. This is expected to further degrade the flexibility of poor, vulnerable communities which make up between 1/4 and 1/2 of the population of the most Indian cities. Climate change is said to become an increasingly important strategic, economic and political concern as it starts to eat into India's high economic growth rates and affect the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. Overall risk in Indian cities typically is associated more with vulnerability than hazard exposure. It is therefore important to understand a number of processes that are rapidly changing India's urban landscape, altering livelihood, opportunities and wealth distribution, which in turn affect the vulnerability of many communities and stakeholders and their capacity to adapt to long-term risk. So, in this episode, let us try to understand this subject under the following headings: India's rural-urban transformation, urban renewal, India's climate change risk exposure, drought, climate change risk and adaptation, Indian megacities. India's rural-urban transformation. Unlike most of the rest of the world, South Asia has been marked by low levels of urbanization despite being one of the most urbanized pre-colonial regions of the 18th century. Only about 30% of the India's population lived in urban areas in 2006, but given its 1.1 billion plus population, its urban population still exceeds that of Japan. The European Union and most other regions of the world except for the United States and China. Over the next 40 years, India will experience one of the most dramatic settlement transitions in history as its urban population grows from about 300 million to more than 700 million. By 2025, an estimated 70 Indian cities are expected to have a population exceeding 1 million. 3 mega urban regions, Mumbai, Pune 50 million, the National Capital Region of Delhi more than 30 million and Kolkata 20 million, will be among the largest urban concentrations in the world. By mid-century, India could have both the largest urban and rural populations of the time. This will have an important bearing on global climate vulnerability and the potential for mitigation and adaptation. Hence, the future direction of Indian urbanization is not only an important domestic concern, but also a major international opportunity to demonstrate the possibility of a more sustainable development. Now, we will try to explain how urban India overtaking the rural India. Urban India overtook rural India in its share of GDP in the late 1990s. The urban per capita incomes are more than 3 times those in rural areas. India's agricultural sector currently contributes only 80% of GDP. Although it provides livelihoods to almost 60% of the population as well as the biomass and ecosystem services that enable the metabolism of most Indian cities to function. Climate change induced disruptions in net primary productivity by human systems could force many Indian cities to adopt in the medium term by altering their extractive relationship with the countryside. Urbanism, or keeping the balance between rural and urban areas, will become increasingly important in India as rural-urban and inter-urban resources and socio-economic conflict became sharper in the future. Migration in India has been controlled by a number of factors, including a crisis in creating new urban formal sector livelihoods in an era of globalization, dismal living and working conditions for the poor in cities, high urban poverty levels driven by high costs of living, poor improvements in rural education until the late 90s and a slow process of social transformation. Alternatively, severe stresses induced in urban areas due to a mix of water scarcity, the breakdown of environmental services, flooding and consequent waterborne diseases and malaria type epidemics combined with a rapid rise in health expenditure could maintain the low current level of rural urban migration. A greater mobility of the backward castes and women could also in time alter the migration dynamics across demographically dominant northern and eastern India. This indicates the potential for climate change to induce bifurcation behavior in migration and hence urbanization trends questions that need to be investigated further. Maintaining two-way flows of food, biomass, water, energy, livelihoods, products and services across the urban range will crucial to India's development transition and medium-term sustainability. Climate change adaptation in both cities and their embedding countryside is an undercover near-term policy concern intimately connected with livelihoods and drought, biomass and energy security. India, like China in the 1990s, is starting to massively ramp up infrastructure investment in the energy, water, transportation and telecommunication sectors to support their growth and expansion. Next is the urban renewal. India made a late start in engaging with questions of climate change despite early environmentalist and academic positions on these questions. While climate change has started to creep into the post-Rio global policy agenda, India has been preoccupied with pressing poverty, economic and social development and political challenges. India has undertaken 4 officially supported national technical assessments of climate change risks, impacts, adaptation and mitigation options since 1992. These assessments were all largely extremely funded and driven. They were coordinated by the Ministry of Environment and Forest, which is far from being a politically powerful ministry, and they were primarily focused on the science of climate change, closely allied to the IPCC agenda and trends of analysis. They were therefore weak in engaging with the complex nature and intensity of vulnerability in India, probably the most critical factor in risk mitigation. The official Indian position on climate change has been strongly tied to fixing responsibility for correcting historical emissions by the OECD countries. Hence, it is focused largely on the greenhouse gas energy nexus, its impact on energy security and technology transfer, and the post-Kyoto opportunities for financial leverage from expected cross-national flows of capital, or as a fringe issue taken up by the environmental NGOs and activists that has little to do with the mainstream economic development agenda. The debate on the adaptation has been weak despite a moderate Indian scientific presence in the IPCC process and an Indian IPCC chair since 2002. A great missed opportunity in the last 15 years was the chance to connect the official climate change adaptation agenda with the rapid development of natural hazard risk assessment, management and mitigation capacity after devastating disasters in the 1990s and the early 2000s. A series of moderately successful post-disaster reconstruction and mitigation programs, especially after the Orissa super cyclone, the Kutch earthquake and the Indian Ocean tsunami, dramatically altered perceptions and the institutional and technical capacity to address vulnerability reduction and risk mitigation in India. India is one of the few large countries that have a central authority to address disaster management and similar well-developed institution at state level. India's climate change risk exposure. Most Indian communities and institutions have a history of coping with uncertainty and extreme events with a great equanimity. However, the current pressure on resources, high population densities and ongoing rapid economic, technological and slower social changes imply that a mix of institutional, market and community led mitigation and adaptation interventions will be necessary if future losses are to be within tolerable bounds. The poor and vulnerable who suffer the most in extreme events should be the first priority. The following sections explore India's climate change related risk exposure, unbundling first, the second order risk and defining a coherent set of adaptation and mitigation measures that could coverage with ongoing natural hazard risk reduction and urban renewal interventions. Temperature and precipitation changes. While there is little scientific doubt about the emergence of climate change as an important risk in the Indian subcontinent over this century, there is still considerable uncertainty concerning precise mechanism and impacts, especially related to precipitation and sea level rise. In spite of the uncertainty, there is broad consensus on the envelope of first order climate change impacts in South Asia over the 21st century. A general increase in both mean minimum and maximum temperatures by 2 to 4 degrees centigrade depending on the realized atmospheric greenhouse gases concentration with an impact on evapotranspiration levels and therefore agriculture, horticulture and forestry and human activities, especially in arid, semi-arid and mountain zones. This could lead to a mean surface temperature rise of 3.5 to 5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, which would imply changes in the location and viability of some settlements and in the pattern of building across the subcontinent, with an increasing role of passive solar and energy efficient design. This regional temperature rise along with changes in the global climate system and the Indian Ocean monsoon system may lead to a mean increase of 7 to 20% in annual precipitation. A 10 to 15% increase in monsoon precipitation in many regions, a simultaneous precipitation decline of 5 to 25% in drought prone central India and a sharp decline in winter rainfall in northern India are also projected. This implies changes in the output of winter wheat and mustard crops in northwestern India, which could have a significant impact on national food security, regional crop mixes and resultant demand for irrigation. This is a most serious risk to rural India and the hope of an agriculture resurgence. Next is the drought. The most serious climate change risk to the Indian economy and its people is the increased intensity, frequency and geographical coverage of drought. Drought typically makes up 1/2 of 2/3 of the natural hazard risk exposure. Its primary impact is in rural areas where agriculture, animal husbandry and to a lesser extent forestry and fishing are significantly affected, leading to cycles of seasonal and distress mitigation and increasing rural debt and a spate of farmer suicide across much of semi-arid India over the last few years. Drought has two typical first order impacts on Indian cities: drinking water shortages and increases in food and biomass fuel prices. It also has a number of important second order impacts: depressed demand for urban produced secondary goods and services because of depressed agricultural demand, increasing seasonal and distress migration from rural areas, continuing severe climate change induced drought that makes subsistence agriculture uneconomical in large parts of semi-arid central, western and southern India could catalyze a sharp increase in migration. This apparently is not factored into current economic development or national security strategy. Climate change is expected to increase the severity of drought, especially in western India, where 5 river basins are expected to face acute to severe water shortages, impacting a large number of cities in Gujarat. Land uses, cropping patterns and poor water resources management in 20th century have resulted in a 50% reduction in the surface water discharge of the Ganga over the last 25 years and in a sharp drop in groundwater tables across the entire Indo-Gangetic plain. The Ganga, Narmada, Krishna and Kaveri rivers are expected to experience seasonal or regular water stress impacting western, northern and eastern India. If the political and economical consequences of the Kaveri dispute and the Narmada struggle are an indication, with the next decade Indian Federation could be severely challenged by these changes. Climate change is expected to increase drought in semi-arid, peninsular and western India, forcing more of the landless and marginal farmers to migrate to cities. They often form the most vulnerable groups in cities, having limited skills, education, capital and access to social networks that underpin much of the economic and social mobility in urban India. They often live in illegal, unserviced settlements exposed to a wide range of environmental risks from flooding to fire and continual cycles of demolition and eviction by civil authorities. They are therefore dual victims of existing natural hazards and emerging climate change, displaced from their original places of residence and occupations and challenged by urban risks in their new urban places of residence. The most serious regional impact of climate change would be changes in the river hydrology in the Indo-Gangetic Plain and the Brahmaputra Valley due to glacial melt and regression of the Himalayan glaciers. Ongoing transboundary conflicts between India and Pakistan and Nepal, India and Bangladesh may be compounded by a possible China-India conflict over the use of the Yarlung-Tarang waters as rivers flow decline and inter-basin transfers are increasingly suggested as solution to challenges of urban and regional water stress. 4 of the 10 largest mega-urban regions of the 21st century, namely Delhi, Dhaka, Kolkata and Karachi, lie on the banks of these great rivers along with more than 30 other million plus cities. Significant changes in river hydrology and the availability of irrigation and drinking water could have a dramatic impact on the growth and development of many small and medium-sized towns and million cities that are expected to mushroom across these fertile plains in the next 3 decades, adding an unprecedented resources dimension to the social and economic transformation of northern and eastern India. Next is climate change risk and adaptation in Indian megacities. Climate change risk is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of current hazards and increased probability of extreme events, spur the emergence of new hazards and vulnerabilities with differential spatial and socio-economic impacts. This is expected to further degrade the resilience and coping capacities of poor and vulnerable communities who make up from a quarter to half of the population of the most Indian cities. Hundreds of the millions of urban dwellers in India are at risk from the direct and indirect impacts of climate change. In July 2005, Mumbai was struck by cyclone that dumped 94 centimeters of rain in 24 hours and leaving more than 1,000 dead, mostly in slum settlements. This event underscores the vulnerability to climate hazards posed by urban poor in Indian cities. Climate change will bring changes in the pattern and trend of temperature, precipitation, climate hazards in the urban areas. An important challenge for India is to reduce the risks of climate change and enhance the resilience of cities. The increasing population in the urban areas of India will further complicate and make the task of reducing vulnerabilities to climate change more challenging. Over the early 21st century, estimates is that an almost equal number of people will live in about 0.6 million villages as in 12 to 15,000 towns and cities by 2050. The issue of climate change has recently entered into Indian public policy agenda within the formulation of National Action Plan on Climate Change in 2008. The issue of climate change mitigation and adaptation has come to the forefront in the public policy agenda. Still, the focus is largely on the mitigation of climate change rather than the increasing adaptive capacity of the people and places to deal with the impacts of climate change. All the population in the urban areas will not be equally vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. People with high adaptive capacity will be less vulnerable, but people who are most vulnerable are the urban poor, slum dwellers and low income category population. These populations have less adaptive capacity to deal with the impacts of climate changes because of poor governance, the lack of investment in infrastructure and in the common and strong connections between the political class, real estate developers and public agencies. Recent research highlights an urgent need to improve our understanding and action on climate variability and adaptation in urban areas as an urgent priority, particularly where poverty levels and population growth rates are highest. Finally, coming to conclusion, we discussed that all the megacities are vulnerable due to the impacts of climate change due to different demographic, socio-economic factors. However, adaptation of cities to climate change has not received much attention at the global level and at the national level in India. What is needed is urban climate change adaptation plans for the vulnerable people in the megacities, the states of adaptation planning in not equipped to deal with the future climate hazards, analysis of opportunities and constraints associated with the implementation of local adaptation measures in 8 cities of the world including Delhi shows that the challenge of climate change adaptation to a large extent connects to and emphasize existing local development concern and they are linked with the local driving factors that determines vulnerability. Further, there is a need to integrate climate change adaptation plans into city development plans which requires the awareness and understanding of climate risks at the local level. The immediate concern for India is to ensure that our cities adapt to the adverse climatic conditions. So students, I hope you people understand the subject. We will meet in the next episode. Take care. Thank you.